Hey guys, tonight you and I are going to step into a world that feels utterly alien to our cozy, well-lit present. Imagine, if you can, a time when justice wasn't dispensed by a sterile court and a prison sentence, but by cold steel, tight ropes, or raging flames, often before a jeering, baying crowd. We're talking about the medieval era, a time of knights and castles, yes, but also a time when life was cheap, brutal, and often short. And at the very heart of that brutality stood a figure both essential and abhorred, the executioner. You probably won't survive a single day in their shoes, let alone a career. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening live, drop your location and the local time in the chat. It's always cool to see who's tuning in from where. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on the edge of a bustling medieval town square, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and maybe, just maybe, a faint metallic tang that makes your stomach clench. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven, worn smooth by countless carts and hurried footsteps. Around you, life happens. Merchants hawk their wares, children chase stray dogs, and the local baker pulls fresh loaves from his oven. It seems almost normal, doesn't it? But lurking in the shadows, living on the fringes of this community, is a person whose mere presence sends shivers down spines, a person whose job is to bring the absolute finality of death to others, often in the most public and agonizing ways imaginable. This is the world of the medieval executioner, and it sucks hard. You see, the executioner wasn't just a guy who showed up when needed. They were often a permanent, albeit shunned, resident of the town or city. Their house was usually located outside the city walls, near the gallows, or in a particularly undesirable part of town, far from the respectable folk. Think of it like being the neighbor everyone avoids eye contact with, multiplied by 1,000, and then add the fact that their job involves lopping off heads. Your kids wouldn't play with their kids. You wouldn't share a drink with them at the tavern, not that they'd be allowed in most taverns anyway. They were essential for maintaining law and order in a brutal age, yet they were treated as utterly defiled, tainted by their constant proximity to death and suffering. It's like being the only person in town whose job description is professional bad day bringer. This isn't just about being unpopular. It's about being ritually unclean in the eyes of society and the church. Many medieval laws and customs explicitly excluded executioners and their families from normal social interactions. They couldn't hold public office, they were often forbidden from attending church services with the general population, sometimes relegated to a separate corner or even outside, and their children faced immense difficulty marrying into clean families. Imagine trying to plan a wedding when half the guest list refuses to be in the same room as your in-laws. It made forming any kind of normal social bond incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Their isolation wasn't just social, it was physical too. The executioner's home was marked, set apart. Maybe it had a specific color door, or was built on unconsecrated ground. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic, reinforcing their status as outsiders. They were needed to perform a vital function for the state or the lord, but that function was considered so vile, so polluting, that the person performing it had to be kept separate. It's the ultimate paradox, a pillar of the justice system who was himself treated as less than human. The reasons for this intense revulsion were manifold. Firstly, there was the simple, visceral horror of their work. They were the agents of violent death, the hands that inflicted pain and ended lives. In a deeply religious society, taking a life, even under legal authority, was fraught with spiritual peril. The executioner dealt with death, with the bodies of the damned, as criminals were often perceived, and with blood, lots of blood. These were all things that medieval people viewed with intense fear and superstition. Secondly, the job often involved touching and handling the bodies of the executed, which were considered polluted. In some beliefs, the executioner might even absorb the sins or the bad luck of the people they killed. It sounds wild, but these were the kinds of fears that shaped daily life and social hierarchy. It wasn't just a job, it was seen as a defilement of the soul. A mainstream historical fact here is that public execution was a deliberate spectacle designed to deter crime and demonstrate the power of the ruling authority. The executioner was the central actor in this grim theater. Their performance was meant to be terrifying and awe-inspiring, a stark warning to anyone considering breaking the law. This wasn't happening behind closed doors. This was the main event in the town square. A quirky tidbit is that in some regions, the executioner was also responsible for disposing of animal carcasses, particularly dogs, which were often associated with uncleanliness or even demonic forces. So, not only were you dealing with human remains, but you were also the town's designated dog catcher and disposal service. Talk about a multi-talented career path. Historians still argue whether the social isolation of the executioner was primarily driven by religious beliefs about defilement, or by a more practical fear of the person who wielded the instruments of death, or perhaps a combination of both. Was it spiritual taint, or just a natural human aversion to the guy who gets paid to hurt people? Probably a bit of column A and a bit of column B, wouldn't you say? Imagine living your entire life under that cloud. Every interaction is strained. People cross the street to avoid you. Children are pulled away. You are necessary, yes, but you are also the embodiment of the town's darkest function. Even the simplest things, like buying groceries, could be difficult. Would the baker want your coin, earned with blood? Would the butcher serve you? Perhaps they had special rules, like leaving the money on a stone or in a bowl of vinegar to cleanse it. This profound social isolation wasn't just a personal hardship, it often forced executioners into insular communities. They might only interact with other executioners, or with people in similarly stigmatized professions, like gravediggers or knackers, those who disposed of dead livestock. It created a sort of grim, unofficial guild of the unwanted, bound together by the fact that nobody else would have them. And this brings us back to that dark, isolated world. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a lived reality. The executioner's house, their family, their social circle, or a lack thereof, it was all set apart. They were needed, tolerated, paid sometimes, but never truly accepted. They were the town's necessary evil, the guardians of order whose own existence was considered disorderly and unclean. You couldn't escape the shadow of the gallows, even when you were off the clock. Your identity was inextricably linked to the horrors you performed. It was a life lived in the dark, both literally and figuratively. So, you've spent the morning being the town pariah, getting side-eye from the baker, maybe having to pick up a dead dog on the way home because, oh yeah, that's also your job. But the real reason everyone knows your face, the reason for the shivers and averted gazes, is the performance. Not a play, not a concert, but the ultimate, morbid spectacle that drew crowds like flies to, well, you get the idea. Public executions were the grim reality TV of the medieval age, and you, the executioner, were the reluctant, reviled star. Imagine the scene. The town square, usually a place of commerce and chatter, is transformed. Scaffolding might be set up, perhaps a sturdy gallows erected overnight, or maybe the ancient, permanent structure stands silhouetted against the sky. People start gathering early, jostling for a good view. Merchants might set up stalls selling food and drink, yes, snacks at an execution. It's a strange, unsettling carnival atmosphere, thick with anticipation and a collective, dark energy. You, dressed perhaps in a distinctive color like red or black, sometimes mandated to make you easily identifiable, adding another layer to your isolation, are the focal point, even before the condemned arrives. All eyes are on you, but none look with warmth or respect. Your arrival with the condemned prisoner escalates the tension. The procession from the prison to the execution site was often part of the spectacle, a final walk of shame for the condemned, sometimes preceded by public humiliation like being drawn on a cart or whipped. You are there, a silent, imposing figure beside them or leading the way, the physical embodiment of their impending doom. The crowd might jeer at the prisoner, but their fear and hatred are often directed at you, the instrument of the state's brutal power. It's less like being an actor on a stage and more like being the prop master who also has to operate the guillotine. Awkward. Once at the scaffold or gallows, your work truly begins. This isn't just pulling a lever, it's a skilled, demanding, and deeply unpleasant task. You have to prepare the condemned, bind their hands, perhaps adjust the noose, position them correctly on the block, or secure them to the stake. You need to know the tools intimately, the weight of the axe, the sharpness of the blade, the strength of the rope, the correct knot. A botched execution was not just painful for the victim, it was a disaster for you. A clean, swift death, relatively speaking for the time, was the mark of a competent executioner. Anything less could incite the crowd, who might turn their anger on you. So, no pressure, just expertly end a human life in front of hundreds of hostile onlookers. The act itself, whether hanging, beheading, burning, or some other horrific method depending on the crime and the location, was the climax of the public performance. You were the one who swung the axe, tightened the rope, lit the fire. Your hands performed the ultimate, irreversible act. And the crowd watched, a mix of fear, fascination, religious fervor, and morbid curiosity. For many, it was a rare break from the monotony of daily life, a stark reminder of the consequences of crime, and a communal experience, however grim. For you, it was just Tuesday. A mainstream historical fact is that public execution was a deliberate spectacle designed to deter crime and demonstrate the power of the ruling authority. It wasn't just about punishing the individual. It was a performance for the masses, a living, or dying, lesson in obedience. The executioner was the key player in this macabre theater, the necessary functionary who made the state's power terrifyingly real. This central role, however, didn't grant you status. It solidified your pariah status. You were the face of death, the one who touched the condemned, the one covered in blood, sometimes literally. Your actions on the scaffold reinforced every superstition and fear the public held about you. You were the master of the axe? Yes, but also the untouchable. A quirky tidbit related to these public spectacles is that in some places, executioners were allowed to keep the clothes of the condemned, and sometimes even sell pieces of the rope or other items associated with the execution as macabre souvenirs. Imagine setting up a little stand next to the gallows. Get your authentic piece of hanging rope! Only 2 shillings! It's a grim side hustle, but hey, a guy's gotta make a living, right? Though I can't imagine the Yelp reviews for that business. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for attending these public executions was genuine civic duty and a desire to witness justice being served, or simply a form of morbid entertainment and a break from the mundane routines of medieval life. Were they there for moral instruction, or just for the show? Probably a bit of both, depending on who you asked in the crowd. Your performance on the scaffold wasn't just physical, it was psychological. You had to project an air of grim competence, perhaps even indifference, while performing acts that most people couldn't even stomach watching. Any sign of hesitation or squeamishness would be met with scorn. You were expected to be efficient, professional, and utterly detached, even as you ended a human life before a crowd that simultaneously depended on you and despised you. It's like being the essential IT guy everyone hates but calls immediately when the internet goes down. After the main event, your work wasn't necessarily done. Depending on the crime and the sentence, the body might be left hanging as a further deterrent, or it might need to be quartered, dismembered, or disposed of. And who got stuck with that job? You did. Handling the dead, particularly the bodies of criminals, was seen as polluting, reinforcing your status as ritually unclean. So, the public performance wasn't just the moment of execution. It was the entire process, from the walk to the scaffold to the disposal of the remains. And through it all, you were the constant, hated figure, the necessary evil whose presence was a stark reminder of mortality and the state's power. You were essential to maintaining order, but your daily life was anything but orderly or accepted. You lived on the fringes, performed in the center, and returned to the fringes, forever marked by the blood on your hands and the fear in the eyes of the crowd. It truly sucked to be that guy. So, you've endured the public gaze, felt the weight of their fear and hatred, performed the grim duty under immense pressure. But how did you even get to that point? This wasn't a job you just stumbled into after answering a Craigslist ad. Wanted person comfortable with sharp objects and public speaking. Must enjoy blood. No, mastering the bloody craft of the medieval executioner required specific skills, a certain kind of stomach, and tools that were, shall we say, less than user-friendly by modern standards. Think about it. Whether it was a hanging, a beheading, or something even worse, the desired outcome, from the perspective of the authorities, at least, was usually either a swift death or a prolonged, agonizing one, depending on the crime and the sentence. In either case, it required precision. A botched hanging meant a slow, choking death instead of a broken neck. A clumsy swing of the axe meant multiple blows, immense suffering, and a very unhappy, potentially riotous crowd. Your job wasn't just to be there, it was to do the job effectively. Let's talk tools. Your toolkit wasn't exactly filled with shiny, ergonomic gadgets. We're talking heavy, often crudely made instruments designed for maximum impact. For beheading, the most iconic tool was the axe or, less commonly depending on the region and status of the condemned, a sword. The axe was heavy, requiring significant strength to wield accurately. You needed to know how to swing it with force and angle it correctly to sever the head in one go. Imagine trying to chop down a tree, but the tree is a person's neck, and hundreds of people are watching, ready to judge your lumberjack skills. The sword, often reserved for nobility, required even greater skill and a perfectly still victim. It was lighter but demanded a more precise, sweeping cut. Hanging was another staple. This involved ropes, knots, and often, a ladder or cart. You had to know how to tie a knot that would hold, position the noose correctly around the neck, often aiming for the hangman's knot, which ideally caused a quick death by breaking the neck, and time the removal of the support, kicking away the ladder, driving the cart out from under them. It wasn't just about dropping someone, it was about physics and knots, under pressure. Messing this up meant the poor soul just strangled slowly, which, while sometimes the point, could also backfire if the crowd expected a quicker end. Then there were the more specialized tools of torture and execution, which often overlapped. The rack, the breaking wheel, the gibbet, branding irons, each required specific knowledge of how to operate them to inflict the intended pain or disfigurement without necessarily killing the person immediately, if it was torture, or in the specific, gruesome manner prescribed, if it was execution. You were the expert in applied agony. It wasn't exactly a skill set you could put on a LinkedIn profile today. Proficient in medieval carpentry, not tying, and causing extreme discomfort. So, how did you learn this delightful trade? Formal training wasn't exactly standardized like getting a degree in accounting. Often, the job was hereditary, passed down from father to son. You'd grow up around the tools, watch your parent work, and gradually learn the ropes, sometimes literally. If it wasn't hereditary, you might apprentice with an existing executioner, starting with the less glamorous tasks like cleaning tools or disposing of bodies, before graduating to assisting on the scaffold. It was hands-on learning, in the most literal and horrifying sense. Your classroom was the execution site, your textbook was human anatomy, seen up close, and not in a medical school way, and your final exam involved ending a life flawlessly. A mainstream historical fact is that the effectiveness of execution methods varied greatly, and a clean execution was often the result of the executioner's skill and the quality of their tools. Accounts from the time describe both swift deaths and horrific, prolonged suffering due to incompetence or poorly maintained equipment. The state relied on the executioner's ability to perform their duty efficiently, even if the public despised them. The tools themselves often carried a heavy symbolic weight. The executioner's axe or sword might be marked with the town's crest or a symbol of justice. They were objects of fear and respect, and sometimes superstition. There are tales of executioners having their tools blessed or performing rituals over them, perhaps to ensure a clean cut or ward off the spirits of the executed. It adds a layer of grim ritual to an already grim job. A quirky tidbit is that some executioners were also responsible for maintaining the instruments of torture and execution, keeping blades sharp, ropes strong, and wooden structures sound. So, you weren't just the operator, you were also the maintenance crew for the town's instruments of death. "Honey, I'm just popping out to sharpen the rack, be back in an hour." Historians still argue whether the medieval executioner was primarily seen as a skilled craftsman performing a necessary, albeit unpleasant, service, or whether their role was so deeply intertwined with the taboo of death and violence that any notion of craftsmanship was secondary to their identity as an outcast. Was the skill admired, or just feared? Probably depended on whether you were the one on the block that day. Imagine the practice required. You couldn't exactly set up dummies in the town square for a rehearsal. Perhaps there were ways to practice technique on animal carcasses, but the real learning happened on the job. Every execution was a high-stakes performance where failure meant not just embarrassment, but potentially chaos, pain, and even danger for you. The crowd's mood was fickle, and a perceived lack of skill could turn their fear into anger directed at the person holding the axe. The weight of the axe, the feel of the rope, the smell of the blood and sweat, these were the sensory details of your daily work. You became intimately familiar with the mechanics of death, the points of vulnerability in the human body, the sounds a person makes in their final moments. This wasn't abstract knowledge, it was visceral, immediate, and constant. It seeped into your very being, another reason why you were seen as irrevocably tainted. So, while the public only saw the final, brutal act, you knew the preparation, the skill, the sheer physical and mental fortitude required. You were the master of a craft nobody wanted to acknowledge, the expert in procedures that were designed to terrify. You were the technician of terror, the engineer of agony, and the ultimate arbiter of finality, all rolled into one deeply unpleasant, socially ostracized package. And you had to be good at it, because your life, or at least your safety, might just depend on a clean swing or a well-tied knot. It really did suck to be that guy. You've just finished the main performance, the crowd is dispersing, maybe heading off to the tavern to discuss your technique, but your workday isn't over. Oh no. Being the town's executioner meant you were also the designated expert for all things grim and gruesome that the respectable folk didn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. We're talking about the stuff that happened before the scaffold, and the stuff that happened after. Your job description was less, justice enforcer, and more. Professional handler of humanity's absolute worst moments, and their messy aftermath. One of the most significant of these lesser-known duties was torture. Yes, the same hands that expertly swung an axe or tied a noose were often employed in the dark, damp confines of a dungeon, applying pain to extract confessions or simply as a form of punishment prescribed by the court. Torture wasn't just random brutality. It was often a formalized process, carried out according to specific rules and using specialized equipment. You were the operator of these instruments of agony. The rack, stretching limbs until joints dislocated. The thumbscrews or boot, crushing bone. The strappato, hoisting people up by their wrists. You were the one who knew how to apply the pressure, turn the screw, or control the drop, ensuring maximum pain without necessarily causing immediate death. This wasn't like assembling IKEA furniture. There was a grim skill involved in using these devices effectively to achieve the desired outcome, whether it was a confession, the naming of accomplices, or simply making an example of someone. You had to understand the limits of the human body, know how much stress it could take before breaking completely, and be able to maintain a chilling composure while inflicting unimaginable suffering. Imagine having to calibrate a machine whose sole purpose is to make someone scream. That was part of your daily routine. And unlike the public execution, this was often done in relative privacy, hidden away from the town's eyes, adding another layer to the secrecy and revulsion surrounding your role. Beyond the torture chamber, there was the matter of the body. Once the execution was complete, the remains of the condemned were still your responsibility. You couldn't just leave them lying there, and burying criminals in consecrated churchyards was generally forbidden. So, you had to take the body down from the gallows, or gather the pieces from the block, and transport them. This might involve loading them onto a cart and taking them to an unmarked grave outside the city walls, often on unconsecrated ground reserved for criminals, suicides, and other outcasts. It was the final indignity for the condemned, and another defiling task for you. Sometimes, the sentence required more than just a simple burial. Bodies might be displayed in gibbets, iron cages where they were left to rot as a warning to others. Quartering, dismemberment, or burning were reserved for the most heinous crimes. And guess who had to perform these grisly tasks? That's right, you did. You were the one wielding the knives, saws, or fire, turning a human body into a horrific public spectacle. This wasn't just manual labor. It was symbolic work, reinforcing the state's power and the ultimate fate of those who defied it. And it further cemented your association with death, decay, and the breaking of the human form. A mainstream historical fact here is that torture was widely accepted as a legitimate judicial tool across medieval Europe, often used to obtain confessions, which were frequently required for conviction, especially in serious cases. While methods varied, the underlying principle of using physical pain to extract information was common practice, and the executioner was typically the one tasked with carrying it out. You were also sometimes called upon for other unpleasant duties that involved dealing with death or things considered unclean. Remember how we mentioned in Section 1 that you might have to dispose of animal carcasses? That ties into this. Anything polluting, anything dead that wasn't a respectable person getting a proper burial, often fell under your purview. In times of plague, though that's a topic for a later section, your duties could expand exponentially to include handling and burying the bodies of the dead, a task even more perilous and reviled than your usual work. A quirky tidbit is that in some regions, specific body parts of executed criminals were believed to have magical or medicinal properties. Pieces of the rope used in the hanging, or even fragments of bone or flesh, might be sought after by people looking for charms or folk remedies. This meant that even after death, the bodies you handled were viewed with a mix of fear and strange desire, and you, as their handler, might have interactions with people seeking these macabre souvenirs, adding another layer of weirdness to your life. Just need a little bit of that guy's leg bone for my rheumatism, mate, no worries. Historians still argue whether the executioner's role in torture was primarily about extracting truth from suspects, or if it was more about demonstrating the state's absolute power and terrifying potential opponents into submission, regardless of guilt. Was it a flawed investigative technique, or a tool of political control? Probably varied depending on the regime and the specific case, wouldn't you say? Imagine the mental toll of this work. Public executions were awful, but at least they were relatively quick performances. Torture could go on for hours, sometimes days, involving intimate, prolonged infliction of pain on another human being. Handling dead, dismembered, or decaying bodies was a constant confrontation with mortality and physical disintegration. These weren't clean, clinical tasks. They were messy, smelly, and emotionally draining. There was no debriefing, no counseling, just the expectation that you would do it again tomorrow. These extra duties reinforced your separation from normal society. While the public executioner was visible and hated, the torturer was often a shadowy figure operating behind closed doors. But everyone knew it was you. You were the one who knew how to operate the rack, the one who dealt with the corpses. These tasks, perhaps even more than the public beheading, marked you as someone deeply involved with the forbidden, the unclean, the terrifying aspects of existence. You were the necessary functionary for the state's dirtiest work, ensuring that the judicial system's reach extended beyond the moment of death, into the realm of pain and the disposal of the unwanted dead. It added so many layers of suck to an already profoundly miserable existence. So, you've survived the public spectacle, the adrenaline is maybe just starting to fade, but the day is far from over. Because, as if the public performance of execution wasn't enough to make you the town's most reviled employee, your job description stretched far beyond the gallows. You weren't just a killer, you were the state's multi-purpose tool for dealing with everything dirty, painful, and dead that nobody else would touch. This, more than just killing, part of the job added layers upon layers to the general suckiness of your existence. One of the most terrifying and constant of these extra duties was operating the torture chamber. While Section 4 touched on this, let's really step inside that dark room for a moment. Justice in the medieval era often relied on confessions, and if a suspect wasn't forthcoming, the question would be put to them more forcefully. You were the one who applied that force. This wasn't just random beatings. It was a craft of calibrated pain, designed to break a person's will without necessarily killing them immediately. You had to know the techniques, the tools, and the human body's breaking points. Imagine the rack. A simple-looking device, essentially a frame with rollers at each end to which the victim's ankles and wrists were tied. Your job was to turn the handle, slowly, steadily, stretching the body. You'd feel the tension build, hear the joints creak, maybe even pop. You had to know when to stop, when a confession was imminent, or when continuing would simply kill them, defeating the purpose of getting information. It required immense control, a chilling patience, and a total suppression of empathy. Or consider the boot, or Spanish boot, a device placed around the leg and foot, into which wedges were hammered. Each blow of the hammer, which you delivered, crushed bone, a slow, agonizing process. Or thumbscrews, applying crushing pressure to fingers or toes. Each tool, each method, from the strappado that dislocated shoulders to burning irons that seared flesh, required your specific, brutal expertise. You were the technician of agony, the one who translated the court's sentence into physical suffering. It wasn't a quick swing of the axe. It was often a prolonged, intimate interaction with someone's pain, a silent, horrific duet performed in the dark. After the public execution, the condemned's body remained your responsibility. You couldn't just walk away. Disposing of executed bodies was a significant part of your workload, and it came with its own set of taboos and practical challenges. As mentioned before, burying criminals in hallowed ground was forbidden. They were seen as sinners, unworthy of rest among the faithful. So you were tasked with removing the body from the scaffold or block, often in front of lingering onlookers or scavenging animals, and transporting it to a designated burial site. These sites were usually outside the city walls, often on unconsecrated land, sometimes specifically marked as a poor ground or felon's field. You were the one who had to dig the grave, often shallow and unmarked, and deposit the body. This constant handling of the dead, particularly the bodies of those deemed sinners or criminals, further cemented your status as ritually unclean. You were literally steeped in death, dealing with decay and the physical remains of those cast out by society, even in their final state. A mainstream historical fact here is that the judicial use of torture was widespread across medieval Europe, though its application and rules varied significantly by region and time period. It was often seen not just as a punishment, but as a legitimate means to obtain evidence, particularly confessions or the names of accomplices, which were frequently necessary for conviction. Sometimes the disposal was even more gruesome than a simple, ignominious burial. For particularly heinous crimes like treason or heresy, the sentence might involve dismemberment, quartering, or burning the body. You were the one who had to perform these acts, reducing a human form to scattered, burnt, or dismembered remains. These acts were highly symbolic, designed to utterly destroy the criminal's physical form and deny them any hope of a bodily resurrection. And you were the one wielding the knives and the fire, adding these horrific skills to your already unpleasant repertoire. It's like being asked to do extreme landscaping, but with people. Fun times. A quirky tidbit related to body disposal is that in some instances, the bodies of executed criminals were used for anatomical study by early physicians or barber surgeons. This was often a clandestine or semi-legal arrangement, as dissecting human bodies was generally frowned upon. As the person who had access to the bodies, you might have been involved in supplying these illicit cadavers, adding another layer of shadowy dealing to your life. Imagine discreetly selling a freshly executed body out the back door. Just another perk of the job. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of torture in the medieval judicial system was primarily a reflection of a genuine belief in its effectiveness for uncovering truth, or if it was more a tool of intimidation and control used by the state to maintain order and suppress dissent. Was it about justice, however flawed, or about power? Probably a complex mix of both, depending on the specific case and the motivations of those in charge. These duties, the torture, the handling and disposal of bodies, the dismemberment, weren't just physically demanding, they were mentally and emotionally scarring. You were constantly exposed to extreme suffering, death, and the most abject aspects of human existence. There was no support system, no way to process the horrors you witnessed and inflicted. You just went home to your isolated house outside the walls, perhaps to a family who also lived under the shadow of your grim profession. Think about the conversations you couldn't have. You couldn't share the details of your day at the local pub, not that you were allowed in any way. You carried the weight of these experiences alone, or perhaps only with the few other outcasts who understood. This constant exposure to the grim underbelly of society, the intimate involvement with pain and death in ways that went far beyond the public spectacle, truly cemented your status as someone apart, someone tainted. It wasn't just about the killing. It was about everything else that came with the package, making the executioner's life a uniquely bleak and isolating experience. You don't live this life alone. Or rather, you do live it alone in terms of social acceptance, but the grim reality is that your profession casts a long, dark shadow not just over you, but over your entire family. Imagine coming home after a day spent operating the rack or disposing of dismembered bodies, covered in the figurative, and sometimes literal, grime of your work, to a household that feels the same weight of revulsion and isolation that you do. Your life as an executioner wasn't just your problem. It was your family's destiny too, and it sucked for them just as much, if not more. Your wife, if you had one, faced constant hardship. She was married to the town pariah, instantly marked by association. Buying goods at the market could be difficult. Would vendors refuse her service? Would they handle her coins with tongs, or demand they be left in a bowl of vinegar, just as they might for yours? Simple errands became fraught with tension and humiliation. She couldn't attend church services alongside other women, share gossip at the well, or participate in community celebrations without facing stares, whispers, or outright exclusion. Her social world shrunk to almost nothing, confined primarily to the walls of your isolated home. How do you even explain your husband's job when someone asks? Oh, he just helps people leave this world. Violently. In front of crowds. And sometimes uses pliers. And the children. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking part. Growing up as the child of the executioner meant a childhood devoid of normal interactions. Other children weren't allowed to play with you. You were likely barred from attending schools alongside respectable children. Your very existence was a source of fear and suspicion. Imagine trying to make friends when your last name is synonymous with the gallows. Birthday parties? Sleepovers? Forget it. Your playmates were limited to siblings, if you had any, or perhaps the children of other outcasts like gravediggers or knackers. Your world was incredibly small and incredibly lonely. A mainstream historical fact is that the profession of executioner was often hereditary, passed down from father to son across generations. This wasn't just a matter of tradition, it was often a necessity. Given the extreme social stigma, it was incredibly difficult for an executioner's children to find any other acceptable profession or to marry outside of similarly marginalized families. The skills of the trade were also highly specialized and not easily learned by outsiders, making the family line the most reliable source of future executioners. So, your son wasn't just inheriting your tools, he was inheriting your social leprosy. This hereditary nature meant that from the moment they were born, your children were on a path that led inevitably towards the scaffold or the torture chamber. They would grow up watching your work, learning the gruesome skills, understanding the deep revulsion society held for their family. There was no escape route, no chance for a different life, unless they somehow managed to flee and completely reinvent themselves, which would have been incredibly difficult in a society where identity was often tied to family and place. It's like being born into a family business, except the business is death and everyone hates the management. The executioner's home itself often reflected their status. It was usually located on the fringes of the town, outside the main walls, near the gallows or the burial ground for criminals. It might have been distinguishable, perhaps a different color paint, or built on unconsecrated ground. This wasn't just about keeping you separate, it was about keeping your family separate. Their home was physically and symbolically set apart, a constant reminder to them and everyone else of their tainted status. Inside, you might find the tools of your trade, axes, ropes, branding irons, perhaps kept cleaned and ready for the next job. Imagine explaining that to your child. Yes, darling, Daddy uses this to make sure bad people learn a lesson. The family's existence was also tied to your often precarious income. While some executioners were paid a regular salary by the town or lord, others relied on fees per execution, tips, or income from those side hustles we mentioned, like disposing of animal carcasses or providing bodies for study. This meant the family's livelihood was directly linked to the frequency of executions and other grim tasks. A busy time for you, the executioner, meant more food on the table, but it also meant more death and suffering that you brought home, either physically or just in the air around you. Talk about a grim commission structure. Kids, the good news is, we can afford shoes this year. The bad news is, well, you saw the square today. The psychological toll on the family must have been immense. Living with someone who regularly performs such violent acts, who is constantly exposed to death and suffering, who is reviled by the community, that takes a toll. The fear of public anger turning violent wasn't just abstract. There are accounts of executioners and their families being attacked or having their homes vandalized, especially after a particularly unpopular execution or a botched job. They lived under a constant threat, simply by association. This profound isolation and shared burden often forced executioner families into insular communities. They might only socialize with other executioner families from nearby towns, or with people in similarly outcast professions like gravediggers, knackers, or even sometimes prostitutes, another profession often relegated to the fringes. They formed their own grim, unofficial network, bound together by the fact that they were the people society didn't want. These relationships, while perhaps providing some measure of companionship, also reinforced their separation from the mainstream. A quirky tidbit is that in some places, executioners' wives or daughters were forbidden from wearing certain types of clothing or jewelry, or from entering certain public buildings or events, further codifying their lower status and social exclusion. It wasn't enough that you were marked, your family had to be visibly marked too, stripped of the small dignities allowed to other citizens. Historians still argue whether the intense social exclusion of executioner families was primarily a deliberate policy by the authorities to emphasize the severity of their role and deter others from associating with them, or if it was a more organic expression of deep-seated religious and social taboos surrounding death, blood, and violence that naturally led to their ostracism. Was it state control, or societal squeamishness? Probably a complex interplay of both, wouldn't you agree? Imagine the conversations around the dinner table, if you even had a table. How do you talk about your day? How do you shield your children from the horrors you've witnessed or inflicted? How do you maintain any semblance of normalcy when your life is built upon the suffering and death of others? You couldn't. The darkness of your profession seeped into every corner of your family's existence, limiting their opportunities, isolating them from their peers, and forcing them into a life lived perpetually in the shadows of the gallows. It truly sucked, not just for you, but for everyone unfortunate enough to be born into or marry into the executioner's family. Okay, so you and your family are social pariahs, living on the fringes, dealing with horrors no one else would touch, and facing constant scorn. Surely, for all this misery, the pay must have been fantastic, right? Enough to build a hidden mansion outside the walls, filled with velvet and fine wine, a little oasis of comfort away from the gallows? Yeah, about that, the price of death, the income you earned from your uniquely awful job, was often as tainted and uncertain as your social standing. It wasn't exactly a guaranteed path to riches, and the money you did make came with its own set of complications and indignities. Your income sources could vary wildly depending on where you were located and who employed you, be it a town, a lord, or even a king. Some executioners received a fixed annual salary. This offered a degree of stability, I guess, like having a steady gig even if the job itself was, soul-crushing. But often, that salary was modest, barely enough to keep your family fed and sheltered, especially given the difficulty your family might have earning income through more conventional means. Imagine your annual performance review. Well, Bartholomew, you really nailed that quartering last month, but we need to see more efficiency on the hangings. Budget's tight this year, so no bonus. Commonly, or perhaps in addition to a small retainer, you were paid per job. A fee for each execution, a fee for each session in the torture chamber, a fee for each body disposed of. This meant your income directly fluctuated with the level of crime and punishment in your area. A quiet period with few executions meant less money coming in. A crime wave, while perhaps unpleasant for the town, meant your ledger saw a bit more activity. It's a grim sort of piecework, isn't it? Your livelihood depended on other people's misfortunes and the state's willingness to inflict pain and death. Talk about a volatile market. Beyond the official fees, there were often unofficial perks and side hustles, some of which were customary rights, others perhaps less savory. One common custom was the right to keep the clothes and possessions of the executed. This could range from rags to fine garments, depending on the status of the condemned. Selling these items, even if they were blood-stained or worn, could provide a bit of extra income. It's a morbid inheritance, collecting the final worldly goods of those you've just dispatched. Lovely hat, isn't it? Belonged to old Farmer Giles. Bit of a stain, but nothing a good wash won't fix. Then there were the truly macabre side hustles. As mentioned before, in some places, executioners could sell pieces of the execution equipment, like fragments of the hanging rope, which were believed to have medicinal or magical properties. People, often desperate or superstitious, would seek these grim souvenirs. You might set up a small stall near the gallows after the crowds dispersed, hawking these items. It's the ultimate niche market, wouldn't you say? Get your lucky, hangman's not here. Guaranteed to, probably not guaranteed to do anything, but it's authentic. Your duties often extended to dealing with dead animals, particularly those deemed unclean or diseased. Disposing of carcasses, especially dogs, was another task often assigned to the executioner, for which you might receive a small fee or payment in kind. So, you weren't just the human death dealer, you were also the town's official animal disposal service. It adds another layer of unpleasantness to the daily grind, doesn't it? Imagine the smell. A mainstream historical fact is that the income of executioners varied significantly depending on the region, the size and wealth of the town or lord they served, and the specific customs regarding fees and perquisites. While some executioners in major cities might have earned a decent living by medieval standards, many others, especially in smaller towns, struggled financially, their income being irregular and supplemented by these grim side activities. Sometimes, payment wasn't just in coin. You might receive payment in kind, food, drink, fuel, or even lodging. These could be essential supplements to a meager cash income. However, even these payments could carry the stigma of your profession. Was the bread given to you baked separately? Was the drink served in a cup kept only for you? These small details reinforce your separation, even in the act of receiving payment. It's like getting paid in tainted goods. There was also the potential for corruption. Given your unique position and access to instruments of pain, desperate people might try to bribe you, perhaps to make an execution quicker and less painful, to deliver a message to the condemned, or even to tamper with evidence in the torture chamber. Engaging in such activities could increase your income, but it also carried immense risks if discovered. It added a layer of moral compromise to an already deeply compromised profession. A quirky tidbit is that in some areas, the executioner had the right to take a portion of the goods sold in the market on certain days, or a specific item from each cart entering the town. This was known as the hangman's share, or similar local terms. It was a form of customary taxation that went directly into your pocket, another way your livelihood was woven into the fabric of town life, albeit in a parasitic and resented manner. Imagine standing at the town gate, demanding your share from arriving merchants. All right, that'll be 1 apple, 2 eggs, and a yard of that nice linen. It's the hangman's due. Historians still argue whether the customary rights granted to executioners, such as keeping the clothes of the condemned or taking a market share, were primarily intended as necessary supplements to their income, a form of state-sanctioned exploitation of a despised class, or relics of older traditions related to purification and the handling of taboo objects. Was it about making a living, or making you even more separate? Probably a bit of both, wouldn't you say? The financial precariousness and the nature of your income added another layer to the suckiness. You were dependent on death and suffering for your living. Your pay was often meager, supplementing by dealing with the literal and figurative leftovers of society. Even the money itself felt tainted, earned through pain and death, handled by hands that inflicted suffering. It wasn't just a job. It was a life where even the simple act of providing for your family was inextricably linked to the grim realities you embodied. Your income was the price of death, and you paid for it not just in your labor, but in your social standing, your family's isolation, and perhaps, the heavy burden on your soul. So you're grappling with the grim reality of your tainted income, knowing that every coin you earn is stained with the misery you inflict. But here's another layer of complexity to your uniquely awful career. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all kind of gig across the entirety of medieval Europe. Just like today we have different laws and customs from country to country, the role of the executioner, the methods of execution, and even the level of social stigma could vary quite a bit depending on whether you were swinging an axe in London, lighting a pyre in Paris, or turning a wheel in Nuremberg. Your suckiness, it turns out, had regional variations. Think of it like different regional cuisines of misery. In England, for a long time, hanging was the primary method of execution for commoners, often performed at prominent locations like Tyburn in London, which became a notorious site of public spectacle. Beheading was usually reserved for nobility, often carried out with an axe on Tower Hill. The English executioner, while certainly reviled, might have focused more on mastering the art of the noose and the block, and perhaps less on the intricacies of complex torture devices, though torture was certainly used at times, especially by the Crown. Your days might involve more rope work and less limb stretching. Cross the Channel to France, and while hanging and beheading were also common, you might encounter different nuances. Breaking on the wheel, a particularly brutal method where limbs were broken with a heavy wheel or club before the victim was left to die on the wheel, was used for serious crimes. Burning was often the fate of heretics or witches. The French executioner might need expertise in a wider variety of truly horrific techniques, making their toolkit perhaps more diverse, and their public performances even more varied in their methods of inflicting agony. It's like needing to be proficient in multiple programming languages, but instead of code, it's methods of excruciating death. In the Holy Roman Empire, covering much of modern Germany and surrounding areas, the variety of punishments and execution methods could be vast, reflecting the fragmented political landscape of cities, principalities, and bishoprics, each with its own laws and customs. The breaking wheel was particularly prevalent here, as was decapitation by sword, considered a more honorable death than the axe. You might also encounter methods like burying alive, drowning, or impalement for specific crimes. An executioner in this region needed to be a true Renaissance man of death, skilled in operating a whole gallery of grim machinery. Your professional development goals would involve mastering new and exciting ways to end a human life. The tools of the trade, therefore, weren't universally standardized. While axes and ropes were common, the design of the axe, the type of rope, the specific configuration of the gallows, or the construction of a breaking wheel could differ. You might inherit your tools from your predecessor, or they might be provided by the town council, perhaps made by a local blacksmith who definitely wasn't happy about the commission. Maintaining these tools was crucial. A dull axe or a frayed rope could turn a difficult job into a disaster, and as we know, a botched execution was bad for everyone, especially you. Imagine trying to get replacement parts for a medieval breaking wheel. Probably not available on Amazon Prime. Beyond the methods of death, the executioner's other duties could also vary. While torture was widespread, its formal role and the executioner's involvement in it differed. In some places, torture might be conducted by specific officials or under the direct supervision of judges, with the executioner simply being the technician who operated the devices. In others, the executioner might have more autonomy, a terrifying thought, in the torture chamber. Similarly, the responsibility for disposing of bodies, maintaining gibbets, or even performing tasks like sanitation, like our friend the gong farmer, who we'll meet later, could be bundled into the executioner's portfolio in some regions but not others. It was a bit of a grab bag of grim tasks, assigned based on local tradition, and who else was willing to do the truly awful jobs. A mainstream historical fact here is that judicial systems and penal practices in medieval Europe were highly localized and diverse. There was no single, unified legal code or set of punishments across the continent. This meant that the specific crimes punishable by death, the methods used, and the procedural rules governing executions varied significantly from one town, city, or region to another, directly impacting the executioner's role and skills required. Even the social standing of the executioner could have regional nuances, though they were almost universally ostracized. The intensity of the religious or social stigma might differ slightly. In some places, there might be specific legal codes defining the executioner's rights, or lack thereof, and limitations. In others, their outcast status might be more based on informal custom and popular revulsion. While you were never going to be invited to the mayor's dinner party anywhere, the precise flavor of your social isolation might have been slightly different depending on your postcode. A quirky tidbit is that in some German cities, the executioner had official duties related to supervising prostitutes or managing the town baths, which were often seen as places of dubious morality or potential disease. So, in addition to dealing with death and torture, you might also be the town's vice squad supervisor or the guy who made sure the public bathwater wasn't too disgusting. It just adds another layer of unexpected, slightly bizarre responsibility to the job description. Yes, I just quartered a traitor. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to go check on the bathhouse sanitation. Historians still argue whether the regional variations in execution methods and the executioner's role were primarily driven by differing legal traditions inherited from Roman law or Germanic customs, by the specific political structures and power dynamics of local authorities, or by evolving social and religious attitudes towards crime, punishment, and the human body. Was it legal history, local politics, or changing beliefs that shaped the specific ways your job sucked? Probably a complex interplay of all these factors, wouldn't you say? The practical implications of these regional differences for you, the executioner, were significant. If you moved from one region to another, your skills might not be directly transferable. You'd have to learn new methods, new tools, new customs, and perhaps navigate a slightly different set of social rules governing your interactions, or lack thereof. It wasn't like getting a job transfer in a modern company. It was stepping into a whole new world of specific, localized horror. Your expertise in the English long drop might be useless in a town that favored the breaking wheel. Furthermore, the types of crimes you dealt with could vary. While murder and treason were universally capital offenses, things like heresy, witchcraft, counterfeiting, or even certain forms of theft might be punished differently, or with different execution methods, depending on the local laws. This meant you had to be familiar not just with the methods, but with the specific legal code that dictated which method applied to which unfortunate soul. You were the final enforcer of a complex, regionally specific system of brutal justice. So, while the core experience of being a medieval executioner, the social isolation, the public revulsion, the dealing with death and suffering, was universal, the specific ways you performed your job, the tools you used, and the additional duties you were burdened with could look quite different depending on where you were. It adds a layer of historical detail to the picture of your miserable existence, showing that even in the depths of this awful profession, there was no single standard for how you were expected to perform your grim, essential work. It truly sucked, but it sucked in locally distinct ways. You've spent the last few sections wading through the particular brand of misery that came with being the town's designated death dealer. The isolation, the revulsion, the gruesome skills, the tainted income, the shadow over your family, it all adds up to a truly awful existence. But here's the thing about the medieval world. While the executioner had a uniquely visible and terrifying role, they weren't the only people trapped in jobs that made life a constant, smelly, dangerous, or deeply unpleasant grind. Medieval society, with its limited technology, poor sanitation, and stark social hierarchies, offered a surprising variety pack of ways to make a miserable living. Think about it. If the executioner was reviled for dealing with death and violence, what about the people whose job involved dealing with filth, disease, decay, and the literal waste products of an entire town? While your job involved the final, dramatic act of state power, Other jobs were mired in the quiet, constant, biological realities that everyone else preferred to ignore. These were the jobs that kept the wheels of medieval life turning, but at immense personal cost to the people who did them. Your hands might be stained with blood, but theirs were stained with, well, let's just say less noble substances. These other awful jobs often shared characteristics with the executioner's lot: low social status, often hereditary, physically demanding, dangerous, and involving exposure to things considered polluting or disgusting by mainstream society. They might not have faced the same level of ritualistic exclusion as the executioner, but they were certainly near the bottom of the social ladder, looked down upon by merchants, craftsmen, and peasants alike. It was a different flavor of suck, perhaps less dramatic than the scaffold, but a slow, persistent, daily kind of misery that might make you reconsider if a quick beheading was really the worst fate imaginable. We're talking about jobs that involved getting up close and personal with the absolute worst aspects of medieval life: the lack of sanitation, the prevalence of disease, the brute force needed for certain tasks, and the constant proximity to death, not just as an inflictor, but as a potential victim. While you, the executioner, were feared and hated, the people in these other professions were often simply despised, ignored, or treated as necessary but unfortunate parts of the urban landscape. Imagine being essential to the town's functioning, but having a job so disgusting that people held their noses when you walked by. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval towns and cities, despite their growth, often struggled with basic sanitation. Open sewers, overflowing cesspits, and the lack of organized waste disposal systems were common, creating environments ripe for disease and necessitating jobs specifically dedicated to dealing with this pervasive filth. These weren't glamorous roles. They were vital for public health, or what passed for it, but they were performed by those with the lowest social standing. Consider the sheer physical labor involved in some of these tasks. While you needed strength to swing an axe or operate a torture device, others were engaged in backbreaking work in appalling conditions. Digging graves, hauling waste, collecting animal hides from slaughterhouses. These were jobs that wore the body down, often led to chronic ailments, and offered little in the way of reward or recognition. Your job might have been terrifying, but theirs was often just relentlessly grim. A quirky tidbit is that some of these low-status jobs, like tanning, processing animal hides, or dyeing using certain unpleasant substances, were intentionally located outside the city walls, much like the executioner's home, because of the terrible smells and polluting byproducts they created. So, you weren't alone in being relegated to the fringes. You had neighbors in misery whose daily work involved vats of foul-smelling chemicals or rotting animal parts. It was the medieval equivalent of being zoned for heavy industry and a correctional facility. Historians still argue whether the low status of these professions was primarily a result of their association with physical dirt and biological waste, or if it was more tied to pre-existing social hierarchies that relegated certain groups or families to these undesirable tasks, reinforcing their low standing across generations. Was it the job that made you low status, or were you given the job because you were already low status? Probably a complex interplay of both, wouldn't you say? These jobs weren't just about physical unpleasantness. They also carried significant health risks. Dealing with human and animal waste, handling diseased bodies, working with dangerous chemicals, these were professions with high rates of injury, illness, and premature death, especially in times of plague or epidemic. While your job put you in danger from a potentially angry crowd or a desperate prisoner, their jobs exposed them to silent, invisible killers lurking in the filth and decay that was their daily reality. It's like choosing between getting punched by a customer or slowly succumbing to airborne pathogens. Tough choice. In the coming sections, we're going to step away from the scaffold and the torture chamber for a bit, and delve into the worlds of some of these other medieval professions that truly redefine the concept of a bad job. We'll meet the people who spent their nights knee-deep in sewage, the ones who collected blood and guts, the ones who faced down death not with an axe, but with desperation and a shovel during times of plague. These were the hidden gears of the medieval machine, turning in the muck and shadows, performing tasks that were essential but utterly dehumanizing. While the executioner's job was a stark reminder of the state's power and the finality of justice, These other jobs were a constant, low-level reminder of the sheer physical unpleasantness and fragility of life in the medieval era. They highlight that misery wasn't confined to the dramatic moments of public punishment. It was woven into the very fabric of daily existence for large parts of the population. So, while you might have thought the executioner had it worst, prepare yourself to discover that the medieval world had even deeper, smellier, and perhaps even more soul-crushing depths of occupational hazard. Alright, so we've established that the executioner's life was about as appealing as a week-old fish left in the sun. But remember how in the last section we talked about other jobs that involved dealing with the absolute worst parts of medieval life, the filth and decay that everyone else ignored? Well, prepare your nostrils, because we're about to dive headfirst into one of the most notoriously awful jobs of the era, the gong farmer. Yes, gong farmer. Not exactly a title that strikes fear into your heart, is it? Sounds almost pleasant. Like someone who tends to a field of large, resonant metal instruments. Reality check, it was anything but. A gong farmer, also known as a gong scourer, was the person tasked with emptying medieval cesspits and privies. You know, the holes or structures where people's waste went. In a world without modern plumbing, these pits filled up, and someone had to clean them out. That someone was you, the gong farmer. Imagine your workplace. Not a scaffold, not a torture chamber, but a deep, dark, often overflowing hole filled with human excrement. Your office hours? Usually at night. Why? Because the smell was so utterly overpowering, so stomach-churning, that doing the job during the day would have made the entire neighborhood uninhabitable. So, under the cover of darkness, you'd head out with your tools, likely a shovel, a bucket, perhaps a lantern, if you were fancy, and get to work. The job was exactly what it sounds like, shoveling raw sewage out of a pit and carrying it away. Bucket by bucket, load by load, you'd haul the town's collective waste, likely on your back or using a cart, to a designated disposal area outside the city walls. The pits could be surprisingly deep, sometimes 20, 30, or even 40 feet down, and the risk of falling in was very real. Falling into an overflowing cesspit? Yeah, that's a new level of bad day. You'd drown in literal filth. Talk about a crappy way to go. The smell, oh the smell. It wasn't just bad, it was an all-consuming, eye-watering, gag-inducing stench that would cling to you, your clothes, your tools, and likely your home, no matter how much you tried to wash. It was the smell of decay, disease, and everything foul that the human body produced. You couldn't escape it. It was your constant companion, a walking, talking advertisement for your profession. Forget social isolation from fear. The gong farmer faced social isolation from sheer, unadulterated stink. People didn't just avoid you, they actively recoiled. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval building regulations in some areas, particularly London, specifically mandated that cesspits could not be dug too close to property lines or water sources, and that they had to be emptied regularly by licensed gong farmers. This shows that despite the revulsion, the job was recognized as a necessary public service, vital for preventing the spread of disease and managing the overwhelming amount of human waste generated by growing urban populations. It was a regulated misery. Your tools were basic and brutal. A sturdy shovel to scoop the thick, compacted waste. Buckets or barrels to haul it up and away. Maybe ropes and pulleys if the pit was particularly deep. It was back-breaking physical labor, often performed in cramped, dark, and incredibly dangerous conditions. You were constantly exposed to pathogens, bacteria, and parasites. Cuts and scrapes could easily become infected. The air you breathed was thick with noxious fumes. This job wasn't just unpleasant, it was genuinely life-threatening, a slow poisoning by your environment. And the pay? Like the executioner, it wasn't a king's ransom. You were paid for your services, often a fee per pit or per load. It might have been enough to scrape by, but it wasn't a path to wealth or social mobility. Your income, like your body, was stained by the work you did. You were the lowest of the low, essential but utterly despised, earning your living knee-deep in the physical output of everyone else's lives. Imagine trying to get a loan from the bank. Collateral? I have several buckets of future fertilizer? A quirky tidbit about gong farmers is that there are historical records of people accidentally dropping valuable items, jewelry, coins, documents, into cesspits. When this happened, they would have to hire a gong farmer to retrieve them. So, occasionally, amid the endless shoveling of waste, you might stumble upon a small treasure. It's like finding a winning lottery ticket while cleaning out a porta-potty. A rare, smelly bonus. Historians still argue whether the extreme low status of gong farmers was primarily due to the inherent disgusting nature of their work and the associated smells and health risks, or if it was linked to pre-existing social strata, with the job being assigned to those already at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, thus reinforcing their position across generations. Was it the job that made you an outcast, or were outcasts given the job? Probably a complex interplay of factors, wouldn't you say? Unlike the executioner, whose grim work was a public spectacle, the gong farmer operated in the shadows, literally and figuratively. Your misery was a private one, played out in backyards and alleys in the dead of night. You weren't feared for wielding instruments of death, you were simply reviled for your association with filth. Your presence was a reminder of the town's dirty secrets, the biological realities everyone else preferred to ignore. Your family life would likely mirror that of the executioners in its isolation. Your home, probably located outside the walls with other noxious trades like tanning, would carry the pervasive smell of your work. Your children would face the same scorn and exclusion as the executioners, simply for being associated with such a vile profession. How do you explain to your kids what Daddy does? Well, sweetie, Daddy makes the stinky go away. For everyone else. The gong farmer's existence was a constant, grinding battle against filth and decay, a life lived in the literal muck of the medieval world. It lacked the grim drama of the scaffold, but it offered a persistent, pervasive level of physical and social unpleasantness that is hard to fully grasp today. You were the guardian of the town's bowels, the necessary evil who dealt with the stuff nobody else could stomach. And for that, you were paid poorly, shunned, and risked your life daily. Yet, being a gong farmer truly, profoundly sucked. You've spent time imagining the life of the executioner, the town's necessary pariah, and the gong farmer, the essential, smelly outcast. Both dealt with the fringes of society, with death and decay in different forms. But what about the jobs that dealt with the inside of the human body, with illness, injury, and the often painful attempts to fix things? Medieval medicine wasn't exactly a spa retreat, and the people who practiced it, particularly at the lower levels, had jobs that were messy, dangerous, and inflicted a whole lot of suffering, often without much success. We're talking about the world of medieval healthcare, where blood, guts, and barbers often went hand in hand, and it added another layer to the general suckiness of life for those involved. Forget sterile operating rooms and pain medication. Medieval medical care for the common person was a far cry from what we know today. While there were educated physicians who studied ancient texts, they often diagnosed illnesses by examining urine or astrological charts, and rarely got their hands dirty, literally touching the patient. The practical, hands-on work of dealing with the body, stitching wounds, setting bones, pulling teeth, and yes, bloodletting, fell to others. And some of those others had jobs that were just plain awful. Let's start with a job that sounds almost pastoral but was anything but the leech collector. Yes, the practice of bloodletting, based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, was incredibly common in the medieval era. It was believed that many illnesses were caused by an imbalance of these humors, and removing blood was a primary way to restore balance. And where did you get the tools for bloodletting? Often from nature. Leech collectors would literally go into swamps, ponds, and muddy ditches, wading in, sometimes with bare legs or even using old horses, to attract leeches. Imagine spending your days, or nights, in stagnant, murky water, feeling the slimy bodies of leeches attach themselves to your skin. You'd then peel them off, hopefully without them biting you too much, though bites were common and could get infected in those unsanitary conditions, and gather them in a bucket or cloth bag for sale to physicians or barber surgeons. Your clothes would be perpetually damp and muddy, you'd likely smell of wet earth and stagnant water, and you were constantly exposed to waterborne diseases and parasites. It wasn't exactly a glamorous life, wading through the muck to harvest bloodsuckers. It's like being paid to be mosquito bait, but slimier and with more potential for swamp foot. A mainstream historical fact is that bloodletting was one of the most common medical treatments performed in medieval Europe, practiced for a vast range of ailments, from fevers and headaches to more serious conditions. It was based on the widely accepted humoral theory of medicine and was performed by various practitioners, including physicians, barber surgeons, and even sometimes by the patients themselves or their families. Then there were the barber surgeons. As the name suggests, these individuals combined the trade of haircutting and shaving with basic surgical procedures. They were the go-to medical practitioners for the common folk, performing tasks that educated physicians deemed beneath them. Your shop might have a basin for washing faces and shaving on one side, and a rack of terrifying-looking instruments on the other. Your skills ranged from giving a tidy haircut to pulling a rotten tooth, lancing a boil, setting a broken bone, or even performing amputations. The reality of being a barber surgeon meant inflicting a tremendous amount of pain. Procedures were done without anesthesia, save perhaps some alcohol or a knock on the head. Imagine having a tooth pulled with crude pliers, or a limb amputated with a saw, while you were fully conscious. The screams of patients would have been a regular soundtrack to your workday. You needed a strong stomach, steady hands, and a high tolerance for human suffering, both your patients and the suffering you caused. Your tools, while perhaps sharper than the executioner's axe for specific tasks, were still rudimentary by modern standards, and sanitation was virtually non-existent. You might wipe a blade on a rag, or rinse it in a shared basin, before using it on the next patient. Infections were rampant, and many people likely died not from their original ailment, but from the treatment they received. It was a high-stakes job where success was rare and failure often fatal. It makes a bad haircut feel like a minor inconvenience by comparison. A quirky tidbit about barber surgeons is the origin of the barber pole. The red stripe is said to represent blood, the white stripe represents bandages, and sometimes a blue stripe was added to represent veins. The pole itself might have originally served as a staff for the patient to grip tightly during painful procedures like bloodletting. So, that striped pole outside a modern barbershop is a direct, if sterilized, link to a history of pain and gore. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of medieval medical treatments, including bloodletting and basic surgery performed by barber surgeons, was primarily due to occasional successes based on practical experience and observation, or if any positive outcomes were largely coincidental, with many interventions doing more harm than good due to lack of anatomical knowledge and hygiene. Was it rudimentary skill, or just blind luck? Probably a complex interplay of both, wouldn't you say? Your social status as a barber surgeon was higher than a gong farmer or a leech collector, but still firmly below educated physicians. You were a craftsman, a tradesman, someone who worked with their hands and dealt with the messy realities of the body. You were necessary, your skills were in demand, but your shop likely smelled of blood, sweat, and unwashed bodies, and your reputation was tied to the pain you inflicted. You might be respected for your skill in setting a bone, but you were also the person who made people scream. Dealing with wounds, boils, broken limbs, these were daily occurrences. You saw the body at its most vulnerable, its most damaged. You had to probe infected wounds, drain pus, cauterize bleeding vessels, often with hot irons, more pain, and stitch torn flesh. It was a constant exposure to bodily fluids, decay, and suffering. You were the frontline worker in a brutal medical system, doing your best with limited knowledge and even more limited tools, often knowing that your interventions might fail horribly. And like the executioner and the gong farmer, the dangers weren't just social or psychological. Infection was a constant threat, both to your patients and to yourself. Handling blood, pus, and diseased tissue without gloves or sterilization meant you were always at risk of contracting whatever ailments your patients had. Your job could literally kill you. So, while the executioner ended lives dramatically and the gong farmer dealt with the end products of life, The leech collector and the barber surgeon were immersed in the raw, painful, often disgusting process of trying to keep people alive in a world that seemed determined to make them sick or injured. Their jobs weren't about the spectacle of death, but the constant, often losing battle against bodily breakdown, performed with crude tools and a complete lack of comfort. It adds another layer to the understanding that medieval life, even for those trying to help, was often a relentless, painful, and deeply unpleasant experience. So, you've seen the messy reality of medieval medicine, the pain inflicted by barber surgeons, the slimy work of leech collectors, all trying to grapple with illness and injury in a world with little understanding of disease. But imagine all that fear of sickness, all that pain and suffering, multiplied by 1,000, descending on your town like a physical shroud. Imagine a sickness so swift, so terrifying, that the usual rhythms of life, the markets, the church bells, even the grim schedule of the executioner, ground to a halt, replaced by the silence of death and the constant, low moan of grief. This is the horror of plague, and specifically, the Black Death, a nightmare that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century and returned in waves for centuries, creating jobs so desperate, so grim, that they made being an executioner look like a quiet retirement gig by comparison. When the plague hit, the scale of death was unimaginable. People would fall sick and die within days, sometimes hours. Families were wiped out, villages emptied, cities overwhelmed. The normal systems for burying the dead, for mourning, for simply carrying on, collapsed under the sheer weight of mortality. Bodies piled up in houses, in streets, in churches. And someone had to deal with them. This wasn't the controlled, state-sanctioned removal of a single criminal's body. This was mass death on an industrial scale, and the people tasked with handling it had perhaps the most dangerous and reviled jobs of all. These were the body collectors, the plague bearers, the mass gravediggers. Often, they were the lowest members of society, perhaps criminals pressed into service, or desperate individuals who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. Their job was simple, brutal, and utterly terrifying: gather the dead bodies, load them onto carts, and transport them to hastily dug mass graves outside the city walls. Imagine walking through streets where death was everywhere, entering homes where entire families lay dead, picking up corpses, stiff, cold, perhaps covered in the dreaded buboes, and piling them onto a cart like cordwood. Your tools were basic: a cart, perhaps a hook or tongs to avoid direct contact, though often desperation meant hands were used, maybe a cloth tied around your face against the stench and the perceived bad air. But no amount of cloth could protect you from the real enemy, the disease itself. You were in constant, intimate contact with the highly contagious dead, breathing the same air in confined spaces, handling clothes and bodies thick with pathogens. Your job wasn't just dealing with death, it was actively courting it. Your life expectancy in this role was likely measured in days or weeks, not years. It's like being offered a job where the uniform includes a bullseye. The sheer physical labor was immense, but the psychological toll must have been crushing. You were surrounded by death, day in and day out. You saw the faces of the dead, perhaps people you knew, neighbors, friends. You witnessed the utter devastation the plague wrought on communities. There was no time for grief, no time for ceremony, just the relentless, urgent need to clear the bodies before the disease spread further. You were the living dealing with the dead, in a world where the line between the two felt terrifyingly thin. A mainstream historical fact is that during major plague outbreaks like the Black Death, the sheer volume of the dead overwhelmed traditional burial practices. Mass graves, often referred to as plague pits, were dug, sometimes holding thousands of bodies, as the priority was simply to dispose of the corpses as quickly as possible to prevent further spread of the disease, rather than offering individual, religiously sanctioned burials. Your social standing, already low if you were forced into this job, plummeted further. You were seen as tainted by death, a walking vector of disease. People avoided you at all costs, recoiling from your presence. While the executioner was feared for inflicting death, you were feared because death clung to you, radiated from you. You were the embodiment of the plague's horror, a grim reaper in rags, shunned even by those who hired you. You couldn't buy food, enter buildings, or interact with anyone without spreading panic. You were isolated not just by profession, but by the very air you breathed. A quirky tidbit is that during plague outbreaks, desperate people would sometimes try to pay body collectors or gravediggers extra to ensure their loved ones received some small dignity in burial, or to place religious objects with the body, despite the hurried nature of the mass burials. These grim negotiations highlight the breakdown of social norms and the desperate clinging to ritual in the face of overwhelming death, and offered a potential, though dangerous, source of extra income for those doing the awful work. Imagine haggling over burial rites while standing next to a pile of corpses. "All right, I'll give you an extra shilling if you promise not to stack him head down." Historians still argue whether the rapid spread and high mortality rate of the Black Death was primarily due to the specific virulence of the Yersinia pestis bacterium, transmitted by fleas on rats, or if it was exacerbated by the unsanitary living conditions, poor nutrition, and lack of medical knowledge prevalent in medieval Europe, creating a population highly vulnerable to disease. Was it a superbug, or a perfect storm of bad hygiene? Probably a complex interplay of factors, wouldn't you say? Beyond collecting and burying bodies, other grim jobs emerged or expanded during plagues. Some people were tasked with sealing up the houses of the infected, trapping the sick and healthy family members inside to die together, a horrifying form of quarantine enforcement. Others might be hired to burn the possessions of the dead, or to clean out infected houses, tasks that carried immense risk. There were also those who tried to profit from the death, perhaps looting the homes of the deceased, adding a layer of predatory cynicism to the general despair. Your family, if they hadn't already succumbed, would live in constant terror for you and for themselves. Your home, no matter how isolated, felt like a death trap. Every cough, every fever, every ache would send shivers of fear through the household. There was no safety net, no escape from the pervasive threat. You were doing a job that was essential for the survival of the community, by clearing bodies, but that job put you and everyone you loved in the direct path of the killer. While the executioner dealt with death one life at a time, a grim but predictable process, the plague worker dealt with death in a chaotic, overwhelming flood. There was no skill to master, only sheer, brutal necessity and unimaginable risk. You weren't feared for your power, but for the death you carried with you. You weren't an instrument of the state's justice, but a desperate figure grappling with a force of nature that defied all human control. The gong farmer dealt with the waste of the living, you dealt with the terrifying harvest of the dead. It wasn't a profession, it was a sentence, a final, awful job in a dying world. And it truly, profoundly, sucked in a way that few jobs before or since ever could. So, we've seen the grim figures who dealt with death and decay in the medieval world, the executioner, the gong farmer, the plague worker, all living lives of isolation and misery. But what about the people they were about to interact with? What about the individuals whose fate rested in the executioner's hands, or whose bodies might end up being hauled away by a plague bearer? We're talking about the prisoners, the people living the miserable, often forgotten, existence locked away in the dark, awaiting their fate. While the executioner's job sucked, being on the receiving end of their services, after weeks, months, or even years in a medieval prison, probably sucked even harder. Imagine you've been accused of a crime. Maybe you actually did it, theft, assault, maybe something much worse. Or maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe someone powerful didn't like you. Whatever the reason, you find yourself dragged away, not to a clean, well-lit holding cell like you might see on TV, but to a medieval prison. And medieval prisons were, to put it mildly, absolutely horrendous. They weren't designed for rehabilitation. They were designed for containment, punishment, and often, simply holding you until your trial or execution. Your new home is likely a damp, dark, cold, and overcrowded space. Maybe it's a tower cell in a castle, a dungeon beneath a courthouse, or even just a dedicated room or building within the town walls. Ventilation is poor, light is minimal, and sanitation is virtually non-existent. You're probably sharing this cramped space with a diverse group of unfortunate souls, petty thieves, debtors, alleged murderers, political prisoners, maybe even people deemed mentally ill. There's no segregation by crime or danger level. You're just crammed in together, breathing the same stale, foul air. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It's a potent cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale food, stagnant air, and the ever-present stench of human waste. Latrine facilities, if they exist at all, are likely just holes in the floor or buckets that are rarely emptied. The floor is probably covered in straw that's infrequently changed, providing a breeding ground for fleas, lice, and rats. Your clothes are likely filthy, perhaps the same clothes you were arrested in, and washing facilities are a distant dream. You are living in a literal cesspool of human misery and biological refuse. It makes the gong farmer's job seem almost appealing by comparison. At least they got to leave the cesspit when they were done. Food is scarce and often of terrible quality. You might receive a meager ration of bread and water, perhaps some thin gruel, if you're lucky. Forget balanced nutrition or variety. You are given just enough to survive, if that. And often, even this minimal sustenance isn't guaranteed. Prisoners might rely on food brought by family or friends, or charity from the outside. If you had no one to bring you food, you could literally starve to death in prison, a slow, agonizing fate that happened more often than you'd think. Talk about involuntary intermittent fasting. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval prisons were primarily places of detention awaiting trial or punishment, rather than institutions focused on long-term incarceration as a form of punishment itself, which became more common in later centuries. Prison sentences as we understand them were rare. You were typically held until you were tried, paid a fine, or executed. Disease runs rampant in these conditions. Cramped quarters, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and constant exposure to vermin create a perfect storm for illness. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox, and other diseases are common, spreading quickly through the weakened population. A simple cold could turn deadly. You're not just fighting for your freedom, you're fighting for your life against invisible enemies that thrive in the filth. The prison is less a place of holding and more a slow-motion death trap. And then there's the violence, both from fellow inmates and from your captors. Guards were often brutal, using physical force to maintain control, or simply for sport. Bribery was common. If you had any money or valuables, you might be able to pay for slightly better conditions, more food, or even a slightly less painful experience if torture was involved. But if you were poor, you were utterly at the mercy of your keepers and your cellmates. Theft, assault, and worse were daily possibilities in such close, desperate quarters. It was the ultimate reality show, except everyone loses. A quirky tidbit is that in some medieval prisons, inmates were allowed to beg from passers-by through grated windows or openings onto the street. They would use bowls or nets lowered on ropes to collect coins or scraps of food. This provided a small, unreliable income stream and a desperate connection to the outside world, while also serving as a public display of the consequences of falling foul of the law. Imagine having to literally rattle a cup and ask strangers for change to avoid starving. Historians still argue whether the appalling conditions in medieval prisons were primarily a result of deliberate state policy aimed at punishing or deterring crime through sheer suffering, or if they were simply a consequence of limited resources, lack of understanding of hygiene and public health, and the low priority given to the welfare of those deemed criminals or undesirables. Was it intentional cruelty, or just widespread neglect driven by poverty and ignorance? Probably a complex interplay of both, wouldn't you say? The psychological toll is immense. You're stripped of your dignity, your freedom, and often, your name, becoming just another body in the crowd of prisoners. The constant uncertainty of your fate, trial, fine, mutilation, execution, hangs over you like the smell of the latrine bucket. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into months, with nothing to do but wait, worry, and try to survive the conditions. Hope is a rare commodity, quickly extinguished by the grim reality of your surroundings and the suffering of those around you. For those awaiting execution, the time in prison was a period of intense dread and reflection. You knew what was coming. You might receive visits from a priest, or perhaps be subjected to further interrogation, maybe even torture, in an attempt to extract confessions or information before your final moment. The executioner, the figure whose job we've explored, might even visit you beforehand, perhaps to assess you, or simply as part of the grim administrative process. Imagine that meeting, the person who will end your life, coming to see you in your cell. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. Your days in prison were a monotonous cycle of hunger, cold, fear, and filth. There were no recreational activities, no opportunities for education or work, unless you were forced into labor. Your world shrank to the dimensions of your cell and the desperate struggle for survival against disease, starvation, and violence. You lost track of time, of seasons, of the world outside the thick stone walls. Your identity was reduced to prisoner, waiting for the system to decide what to do with you. And when that day came, when the guards arrived to take you to the scaffold, you weren't just walking towards death. You were often walking away from a living hell that had already broken your body and spirit. The walk to the execution site, the public spectacle we discussed earlier, was the final, terrifying act, but the misery had been a long, slow burn in the darkness of the prison cell. While the executioner's job was the sharp, brutal end, the prisoner's experience before the block was a prolonged descent into the most abject depths of medieval human suffering. It truly sucked to be waiting in that darkness. So, you've spent time with the executioner, the man who delivered the final blow, and peered into the miserable existence of the prisoner awaiting that fate. But what happens in that grim theater after the main actor has taken their final, involuntary bow? The crowd might be dispersing, the officials might be leaving, but the story isn't quite over. The body remains, and its journey after the final breath involves another set of tasks, often falling back to the hands of the executioner, but sometimes involving others whose jobs were just as deeply intertwined with death and the taboo. For you, the executioner, your work often wasn't done when the rope tightened or the axe fell. As we touched on earlier, the responsibility for the body of the executed criminal typically rested with you. This wasn't a quick and easy task, especially depending on the method of execution and the specific sentence. If it was a simple hanging, you had to wait until life was certainly gone, then cut the body down. If it was a beheading, you had to handle the decapitated remains. If the sentence involved dismemberment, or quartering, reserved for crimes like high treason, your grim labor had only just begun. You were the one who had to perform these acts, turning a human body into scattered pieces for public display or disposal. It's like being the cleanup crew for history's most gruesome events, except you were also the main performer. The purpose of handling the body after execution went beyond simple disposal. For many crimes, particularly serious ones, the body was deliberately subjected to further indignities or displayed publicly as a continued warning. This is where the gibbet comes in, those iron cages where bodies were left to hang and rot, sometimes for months or even years, exposed to the elements and scavenging animals. You, the executioner, were often responsible for placing the body in the gibbet and ensuring it remained there. Imagine having to climb up and secure a decaying corpse in a cage, the smell overpowering, the sight horrifying, all as a public service announcement. It's like putting up a really unpleasant billboard. Burying executed criminals in consecrated ground, like a churchyard, was almost universally forbidden in medieval Europe. These individuals were considered sinners, often excommunicated or denied Christian burial rites. Their bodies were seen as polluted, unworthy of rest among the faithful. So you were tasked with transporting the body, or its parts, to an alternative burial site. This was usually an unmarked grave outside the city walls, often an unconsecrated ground specifically designated for criminals, suicides, the poor, or other outcasts. It was the final separation, the physical manifestation of their expulsion from society in both life and death. You were the ferryman to the unhallowed ground. The process of transporting the body could be another public spectacle, albeit a less dramatic one than the execution itself. The corpse might be loaded onto a simple cart and paraded through the streets one last time, a final walk of shame for the deceased, a reminder to the living of the ultimate consequences of crime. And you were there, accompanying the cart, the grim escort for the unwanted dead. The stares and revulsion you faced weren't just because you were the executioner. They were also because you were the one handling the tainted body. A mainstream historical fact is that the posthumous treatment of executed criminals' bodies was a deliberate part of the judicial punishment in medieval Europe. Displaying bodies, dismembering them, and denying them Christian burial were intended not only as deterrents but also as symbolic acts aimed at denying the criminal dignity in death and potentially hindering their soul's passage or bodily resurrection, reflecting deep-seated religious beliefs of the time. Beyond the executioner, other people were sometimes involved in the handling of dead bodies, especially those outside the context of judicial execution. Gravediggers, for instance, were essential for burying the respectable dead in churchyards, but their jobs still involved constant proximity to death and decay, often leading to a lower social status, though usually higher than the executioner or gong farmer. In times of plague, as we discussed, their workload became unimaginable, and the job became one of the most dangerous imaginable, falling to whoever was desperate or forced into it. A quirky tidbit related to the handling of bodies after execution is the practice of gallows confessions. In some regions, the condemned were allowed to speak from the gallows before their execution, and their final words, including any confessions or accusations, were sometimes recorded. After death, their bodies might be further examined or handled to corroborate these confessions, adding another layer of grim procedure to the post-execution tasks. Imagine having to check a body for signs of witchcraft because the person confessed to it just before you hanged them. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on the posthumous treatment of bodies was primarily driven by genuine religious fears about the fate of the soul and the power of the physical form, or if it was a practical tool of social control and political intimidation, using the dead body as a powerful symbol of state power and the consequences of defiance. Was it about spiritual damnation, or just scaring the living? Probably a complex interplay of both, wouldn't you say? Dealing with dead bodies, particularly those of criminals or plague victims, carried immense social and spiritual stigma. In a society deeply concerned with ritual purity and the proper handling of the dead, constant contact with corpses, blood, and decay marked you as unclean. This wasn't just a matter of hygiene, it was a perceived spiritual taint that further isolated you from the community. Your job wasn't just to end a life, it was to handle the physical aftermath, the messy, taboo reality of what was left behind. The tools for handling bodies weren't complex: hooks, ropes, carts, shovels. But the work was heavy, often performed in unpleasant conditions, and always fraught with the psychological burden of dealing with death in its most raw form. You became intimately familiar with the physical reality of mortality, the process of decay, the fragility of the human form once life had departed. This constant exposure to the physical manifestation of death, combined with the social revulsion it inspired, made the post-execution duties another heavy layer of misery in your already grim profession. For the families of the executed, retrieving the body for a proper, albeit likely private and discreet, burial was a difficult and often expensive process. They might have to petition the authorities and pay a fee to claim the remains, adding financial burden to their grief and shame. If the body was displayed in a gibbet or dismembered, retrieval might be impossible, leaving the family with no body to mourn over, no grave to visit. Your handling of the body was the final act of the state's power over the condemned, severing their connection to their family even after death. It truly sucked, right up to the moment you became a historical footnote being hauled away on a cart. Alright, you've journeyed deep into the shadows with me tonight. We've walked the lonely path of the executioner, felt the weight of the axe, smelled the reek of the gone farmer's pit, stood trembling in the dark of a medieval prison cell, and faced the overwhelming horror of the plague alongside the body collectors. We've seen a world where life was often short, brutal, and incredibly unpleasant, where certain jobs weren't just difficult or dangerous, but were steeped in social revulsion, physical misery, and constant exposure to death and decay. It's a stark contrast to the world you inhabit now, isn't it? A world where sanitation is, mostly, taken for granted, where medical care, while imperfect, doesn't usually involve leeches or hot irons as a first resort, and where the jobs dealing with death and waste are thankfully hidden away, performed by professionals with safety protocols and, one hopes, better pay and social standing. We explored why the executioner was such a uniquely hated figure, essential yet utterly outcast, feared for his power over life and death, reviled for his proximity to blood and suffering. We saw how his family lived under that same dark cloud, forever marked by his profession, their lives limited by the deep-seated taboos he embodied. Then we stepped beyond the scaffold to find that medieval society offered a whole spectrum of jobs that competed for the title of worst ever, from the gong farmer, whose daily battle was against the literal tide of human waste, to the leech collector and barber surgeon, navigating the messy, painful realities of medieval medicine with crude tools and limited knowledge. And in times of crisis like the Black Death, we saw how new levels of horror emerged, creating jobs like plague body collector that were less professions and more suicide missions, performed by the desperate and the doomed. We even peered into the dark, miserable existence of the prisoner awaiting their fate, a life of filth, hunger, and fear before the final, public act. It's easy to look back from our comfortable vantage point and feel a sense of distance from these lives. But remember, these were real people, trying to survive, to feed their families, to navigate a world that offered very little in the way of comfort or security for those at the bottom. Their jobs, however awful, were necessary for the functioning of their society. Someone had to enforce the law, someone had to clear the waste, someone had to try and mend broken bodies, and someone had to deal with the overwhelming dead. They were the hidden gears, turning in the shadows, making life slightly more bearable, or at least less chaotic, for everyone else, while enduring a level of misery that is hard for us to truly comprehend. Your worst day at the office probably doesn't involve dodging rats in a cesspit or getting blood splatter on your face. A mainstream historical fact that ties many of these jobs together is their shared characteristic of being considered unclean or dishonorable professions, often subject to specific legal restrictions or social customs that limited the rights and interactions of those who practiced them. This wasn't just random prejudice. It was often codified, reflecting a societal need to separate the respectable world from the dirty, dangerous, or taboo necessities of daily life and death. A quirky tidbit that bridges the gap between some of these jobs is that in some medieval towns, the executioner was also responsible for supervising the knackery, the place where dead livestock were processed. So, your day might literally go from executing a criminal to overseeing the disposal of animal carcasses, a full spectrum of dealing with the unwanted and the dead. Talk about a diverse portfolio. Historians still argue whether the extreme social stratification and the assignment of these awful jobs to specific, often hereditary, groups was primarily a function of practical necessity in a pre-industrial society, or if it was deeply rooted in religious beliefs about ritual purity and the spiritual taint associated with blood, death, and bodily waste. Was it efficiency or piety that shaped this hierarchy of misery? Probably a complex interplay of both, wouldn't you say? These were lives lived on the fringes, essential but excluded, performing tasks that were vital but utterly dehumanizing. They remind us that history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about the everyday struggle for survival, the dignity found, or lost, in labor, and the surprising variety of ways you could have a truly, profoundly terrible job. It makes you appreciate the small comforts of your own life, the clean water, the flush toilets, the fact that your job description doesn't involve public dismemberment, or wading through sewage in the dark. As we step back from this grim period, leaving the creaking gallows, the reeking pits, and the shadowed dungeons behind, let that contrast settle over you. Feel the safety of your modern surroundings, the quiet comfort of your room. The sounds of the medieval world, the jeering crowds, the screams from the torture chamber, the rattle of the death cart, the silence of the plague-stricken streets, are fading now. Let the darkness we've explored tonight remain in the past, safely confined to the history books and our imaginations. You are here, now, in a time and place far removed from those harsh realities. Feel the softness of your bed, the warmth of your blanket. The air is clean, the night is quiet. There are no plague pits outside your window, no executioner sharpening his axe down the street. Allow your breathing to deepen, becoming slow and steady. In and out. In and out. Let the tension drain from your body, from your shoulders, down your arms, into your hands. Release any lingering images of the grimness we discussed. They belong to another time, another world. You are safe here. The weight of history is lifting. The echoes of those difficult lives are softening into a gentle hum. Let your mind drift away from the specifics, from the jobs, the smells, the sounds. Just the feeling of being here, now, comfortable and secure. Your eyelids feel heavy. Sleep is waiting, a soft, dark blanket ready to welcome you. Let your thoughts become light, like clouds drifting across a night sky. No need to hold on to anything, just let them pass. You are relaxed, peaceful, ready to rest. The journey into the darkness is over. It is time to return to the light, to the quiet, to sleep. Sleep now.